I'm very excited to welcome Jen Brandel with us today. Jen is the co-founder of Harken, a company that helps organizations around the world develop and operationalize participatory processes. Harken took home the prize for Best Bootstrap Company at South by Southwest and won the News Media Alliance Accelerator. Jen also received the Media Changemaker Prize by the Center for Collaborative Journalism, was named one of 30 world-changing women in conscious business, and is a Columbia Sulzberger Fellow, an RSA Fellow, a member of the Guild of Future Architects, and the National Civic Collaboration. I could keep going because Jen's been an incredible friend to MPP in this space, but I will hand it over to Jen now to introduce our next two panelists. Take it away, Jen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ariel. Greetings from New Mexico. I'm here starting a vacation strong with a little bit of fun here to talk with Rob and Jay about the Correspondent English language US version of the Correspondent, and to learn from what they learned along the way. So they probably know introduction, but Rob is the founding editor of The Correspondent, and Jay is the director of the Membership Puzzle Project and professor at NYU. And my goal for today is to draw out as many lessons as we can from this endeavor that was The Correspondent that may be useful to other membership-based organizations. And my sense, though, is if you've seen one membership-based organization, you've seen one membership-based organization. That is to say, there's a lot of ways each are idiosyncratic or combine different elements for their own uses and for their own audiences. So knowing that there's going to be some things that are distinct to The Correspondent, I will still do my best to draw out as many lessons as I can. So with that, I will launch right into questions because we don't have that much time, and we will make time at the end for questions from you all as well. So feel free to start parking those in the chat or the questions area. So hello, Rob. Hello, Jay. Great to be with you both today. I wanted to start off with a question for Rob. Oh, good. Excellent. Take us back to starting The Correspondent. What led you to decide that starting a US English version was worth attempting?
Well, one of the first things that came to mind, that comes to mind when I hear this question is the opportunity to work with somebody like Jay. He was a big inspiration to our model, our journalism, even before we started The Correspondent. So the opportunity to do this in an English language environment with somebody who we admire so much, that was a big reason. On a more theoretical level, there were other reasons, obviously. For example, Ernst Jan Fout, my co-founder, and I have traveled the world extensively, and everywhere we came, we saw this great enthusiasm about our kind of journalism, the member model, not just from journalists, but from readers as well, all over the place. So we really got the sense that this model could be not just a Dutch phenomenon. And secondly, the idea of sort of collaborating with experts from all over the world instead of just our tiny Dutch language, which has some like 20 million speakers, excited us a lot. And also, and lastly, I think we try to do journalism that makes you understand the world a little bit better on a sort of systemic or fundamental level. And so many problems and challenges we face in our societies are transnational. So it made sense theoretically to do a transnational form of journalism to talk about those kinds of problems. So that's how we came up with the idea.
Excellent. And Jay, you've been vocal about many of these same issues that The Correspondent and The Correspondent have been exemplifying for decades. So what made you decide to go all in on endorsing an organization from your position as a professor, as a media critic, and someone who hasn't been in the day-to-day of newsrooms as much?
Well, it was many things. The first is that The Correspondent's member-funded model was, at the time that I learned about them, supporting 21 full-time correspondents in the Netherlands. That's a big newsroom. That's impressive. There are a lot of startups that would love to have 21 full-time correspondents paid for by their readers. A second thing that really weighed in for me was no ads. The policy of no ads is not only means you're not dependent on the whims of advertisers, but it means you don't have to do the kind of content or journalism that draws enough readers to get ads. And a lot of bad habits that digital journalists had developed revolved around the need to get advertisers. And I felt no ads was like almost like a rebirth of digital journalism. Another reason was their philosophy, which I think Rob came up with this phrase for it, not the weather, but the climate. Meaning their journalism tried to fix not on the daily events or the controversy of the day, but on longer trends and problems as they emerged over time. So not the news today, but what's news every day. And I felt that was a really important contribution as well. Not to say that the Correspondent invented it or nobody else ever thought of that problem, but it was a key part of their method. Another thing they did that I thought was innovative was shifting power to the writers. The 21 full-time correspondents at the Correspondent were allowed to define their own beats and choose their own reporting projects. So they were lodging editorial responsibility and power with the writers as opposed to the editors, which is very different from how most newsrooms in the US at least are organized. Also, they valued their members not just as revenue sources, but as sources of expertise, experience, knowledge, and they had done several things to build that into the way that they were working. I was also impressed with their finesse with paywalls, where they had a paywall. If you went to the decorrespondent.nl, you couldn't access the content there, but if you came across any Correspondent article online or in social media, it was always free to click on it. So you were never in this frustrating situation where you found out about a really good piece, but you couldn't actually access it. I could go on, the profit cap, the constructive journalism model they had, which was you can't write about problems unless you also write about what we are going to do about them. No corporate sponsors, no view from nowhere. And one other really important thing, which they pledged to experiment with in the English language version, which is a pay what you can model. That's a really interesting thing to try. And I felt that the world needed to know, does that actually work? Can you do that? Can you do a pay what you can model and get the kind of revenue you need? So those are all of the things that excited me about working with them and being part of this launch. And all of them I felt, while again, not original to the Correspondent, together they made for an original model.
Yeah, just hearing you rattle off all of these different things, you can see the impact that the Correspondent and the Correspondent has made on the ecosystem with a lot of these ideas being incorporated by others. But we'll get to that again later. I want to rewind to your thinking. Rob, I'll start with you in terms of what was your best case scenario of what you thought the English language version would yield? And at the time, what did you think could be the reasons why it might fail?
Well, here probably the first sign of what went wrong may appear, because we really didn't envision too much of sort of the kind of newsroom we had in mind. And one of the reasons is that we didn't do that either when we started The Correspondent. We had this idea, and I'm a trained philosopher, so I'm good with ideas, good with principles. I don't really necessarily make the practical step, and neither does my co-founder Ernst, to say, okay, we need this or this newsroom or these people or whatever. We run with the idea and we make people enthusiastic about the idea, and then we see what happens. And this went very well in the Netherlands, and the newsroom that sort of organically grew out of it functioned. But because we sort of took that cultivated naivety, as Ernst likes to call it. Like, don't think about that now. We'll see that when we get there. A bit too far, we came unprepared, basically. We had to make all these envisions and decisions when too late, basically. So we focused a lot on the campaign, getting our principles across, getting our ideas across, getting the necessity across of why we think this is important to do. And that was a success. I mean, it was very, we didn't think it was amazing to see that we could raise over $2.5 million with these ideas. But putting them into practice, that was something that was just hugely underdeveloped. And we sort of got away with it in retrospect in the Netherlands, because we really know this market and the way the newsroom culture is, and everybody's from the same country. So that makes for a different sort of bringing together. It works more organically. But in this context, there were so many factors that we didn't think of, that putting it together in an actually functioning newsroom was much more difficult. One of the possible failures we envisioned, that we did think about a lot, was the problem of the view from nowhere. Like, we know we adhere to the view from somewhere, but how much of that somewhere is geographic, right? I have a hunch and a sense that it doesn't need to be, but overcoming the view from somewhere in a geographical sense takes a lot of extra steps and a lot of extra things to think about before you can make that happen. And we thought about it, but still it was more difficult to implement than we thought in theory. Mm-hmm. Does it answer your
Jay,
question?
what about you? Yeah, that's great. Jay, what did you think could lead to the Correspondent failing? And also, I know as a startup founder, you need to really ride optimism. If you think too much about failure, you're not going to do anything. But what did you think might lead to the experiment not succeeding?
Well, to go back to the campaign, because the Correspondent felt very strongly that the campaign should be based on principles, we declined to do what many people's first instinct was, and mine, in fact, which was to produce some sample journalism so people might know what kind of thing that they were joining. And Rob, I remember conversations with him many times about this, was very clear on this. No, we must not do that. And I think the reasoning, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the reasoning was, if you get people excited about the principles of the Correspondent, they will each imagine it in their different way, in the shape of the journalism they want to see. And this will cause them to become members. Now, inevitably, when you move from the stage of the campaign, where you're exciting people about the possibilities of the Correspondent, to the stage where you actually have to start publishing, some of those people are going to drop out because it doesn't turn out to be what they thought it was, right? It's like, sort of like the Obama campaign in 2008. This is a very unknown person, in many ways untried, but very promising. His rhetoric was soaring. He was articulate. He was dynamic. And so people tended to imagine Obama in the shape that they wanted him to be. So we were prepared for some people to not find the Correspondent that actually began publishing their thing, but because that had happened with Day Correspondent, but other people who didn't join the campaign would sign on, and hopefully the wins outlay the losses. And so that was the way it was supposed to work. But I think the whole idea of global, but in English, contained many more traps and problems than anybody involved in the Correspondent knew. For example, I mentioned earlier this philosophy of constructive journalism, not just the problems, but what can be done about them. Well, when you get to what can be done about them, and you're trying to publish globally, but in English, that immediately puts you into the frame of the nation state. We can only do things about our problems from within the resources of the nation, right? But there is no one nation that the Correspondent was publishing about or to. So I think the whole idea of global journalism is problematic and perhaps mislaid, because there really isn't such a thing as global citizenship. Even though there's a kind of sort of global awareness that citizens can have, you can have concern for the planet, for example, but you can't actually live as a global citizen. So that was a big deal. And I think we and the Correspondent underestimated the difficulty of transforming its principles into practice at that level. Another problem was, with $2.5 million, that sounds like a lot of money, but it only went so far. And so the original newsroom of The Correspondent would only be 5 or 6 journalists, which is not enough to meet the potential that people were sold on during the campaign. So to sum it up, there was a trap built into the very principles that we got people excited about, which is they became fans of a concept that was kind of never going to be translated into actual journalism they could patronize. And I don't think the founders of the Correspondent were quite ready for that.
Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up questions from there that we'll get to. And I see Anjali has a great question as well. I'll ask from the Q&A shortly too. As you and Ernst wrote in the letter about shutting down the Correspondent, there were many factors that led to that decision to stop the experiment. And so I wanted to dig into a few that might be useful for other member-based organizations, because most of the folks in MPP, I don't believe, are attempting the same global coverage that the Correspondent was. They are more place-based or topic-based. So in terms of cited member cancellations and not making revenue from membership to cover the costs, tell us more about the reasons people were canceling. We know that there was that initial, snafu with the botched campaign, but what are other potential reasons? Financial insecurity, the ever-present credit card expiring situation that a lot of membership-based organizations run into. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think led people to cancel and not have that base in year 2 and retain?
Sure. Yeah. Let me give you an example, not as an excuse example, but because it illustrates our more fundamental shortcoming. Obviously, COVID, the pandemic, hit. Now, in some sense, this is a dream topic for a transnational journalism platform, because it's the ultimate manifestation of globalization and transnational problems that we're all in together. This is basically the first time the whole world has the same problem. So from a theoretical viewpoint, this should be a huge leg up from a journalism perspective for a transnational journalism platform like ours, and it wasn't. On the contrary, it was a drain on our memberships. A lot of people canceled because of it, and not because of the financial insecurity, although that might have played a role, but because we were not offering them something that actually mattered to them enough to pay us for it. While at the same time, and this is interesting to note, membership on the Dutch side surged because of the pandemic and the coverage we had on the Dutch side. And that tells you something, that although in theory, this is a very global, transnational problem that affects us all and has transnational origins, the food chain, globalization. The thing that Jay just mentioned, there's no such thing as a global citizenship, although there's a global awareness, applies very much here, because the information that people wanted was quite local. They were, especially in the beginning, were talking about number of cases in their country or number of cases in their area, not the let's say globalist origins of the whole problem. So the Dutch side became quite relevant because it was confined to this space. The transnational side became sort of irrelevant because people were trying to get different information, more local information than we had to offer. Now, and here's the thing: we had some great journalism on this topic. We had amazing pieces about how social distancing wouldn't work in the African continent. We had great pieces on how, let's say, global inequality with regards to the vaccine would, if the vaccine were there, would permeate, et cetera, et cetera. But we're sort of ahead of the curve. The context view that we took was ahead of the curve of the actual necessity that people felt they wanted to with regards to their information. So it's an illustration of how the view from somewhere wasn't thought through enough to actually be able to connect what people were caring about and what we were offering. And that ran through sort of as a basic problem through a lot of our challenges.
So it sounds like from what you're saying, Rob, part of the reason for cancellations was just a lack of relevance to people in the immediate, whereas the Dutch Correspondent was doing so well. This kind of like big contextual, people were looking for immediate information about their place, their city, their the COVID numbers where they lived. So it sounds like part of the reason people were canceling was they didn't find it as relevant. Were there other reasons though as well? Like did the initial botched campaign lead to a sizable amount of membership cancellations, or was it more that was just a PR issue but not affected the membership numbers that much?
No, not really. Not really. People are not in that bubble necessarily, or in that sort of information environment necessarily. A lot of journalists plays out on Twitter. That's not necessarily the place where people, some do, but it's a minimal number. No, I think it's always good to first ask, instead of going to external factors like that, criticisms or whatever, to first ask, what are we providing that is not getting people to consider paying for it? It's at its core, that is most likely your problem. The product, if you want to call it like that, as a product, isn't fitting the needs.
Okay,
Yeah.
and there's a message. I'm seeing some great questions here in the Q&A that I can weave in. So from Chani Gio, he wanted to know, were there any hints in a sense that allowed the team to predict the low membership renewal rate? So we know that, you know, getting a big campaign and getting people really excited, and you had fabulous representation in terms of people who were vouching for the Correspondent. But then, you know, year one, when you have to ask people, all right, let's renew, were you able to see that coming?
Oh yeah, we could have, and we did also see signals. Obviously, we overlooked a lot of signals as well. Otherwise, we would have been doing things differently. But we definitely saw signals. Now, for example, you can see it in the most basic things like open rates for emails, or how many people responded to the journalism, and also, for example, the sort of skew towards Dutch members, who were relatively, although they were not the biggest part of the membership base for the international platform, were relatively vocal and engaged. So it sort of became a Dutch not a Dutch-backed platform, but sort of more heavily reliant on Dutch membership instead of, let's say, the rest of the world. So we could see signals. You could also see it, for example, in how the development of the pay what you can sort of averages that sort of slowly went down. That could have been a signal. But nevertheless, we know that these signals were apparent in on the Dutch platform as well. But we managed to outgrow it when making our journalism. So we especially in the beginning, we had the approach of no, don't worry, let's just do our best journalism and it will sort of pick up. But that happened way less than what happened at the Dutch Correspondent.
Yeah, so that brings me to kind of another section of questions, and Anjali touches on this in the Q&A. So she wanted to know why the Correspondent got such a big initial funding before the membership drive. So while the Correspondent was focused on becoming sustainable just through memberships, there were a few $1 million put in from different foundations to really launch it and get going. So she wanted to know, why do you think it got such big initial funding before the drive without the local knowledge in any sample projects? Do you think it was the principles that really excited them and the success of the Dutch version, or what did you hear from funders that got them really on board?
Well, the political answer is you have to ask the funders, of course. But yeah, now, well, we had a sample, which was a very successful Dutch version of, and also one of the foundations that actually helped us do the international expansion was a Dutch foundation, and not the only one, but it was a Dutch foundation. So they knew our platform, our Dutch platform, very well, and they were excited about the principles and the idea of sort of exporting those principles to the rest of the world and not just make it a Dutch endeavor. Yeah, and obviously the charisma of the founder. I mean, right? I'm kidding.
Also,
no, I mean, it is true. Oh, go ahead, Jay. Yeah.
I think there was an attraction also, not just to the fact that the Dutch model was working, but the funders could fund the infrastructure and the costs of the campaign and know after a certain amount of time, a year, 2 years, whether the operating expenses were being met by the members. Like there was a test for whether their funding would work. And the test basically was, after the first year of publishing, how many of the members renewed and did enough renew to keep publishing. And very rarely in grantsmanship do you get a clear answer to what you're trying to support. So I think that had something to do with it as well. As you could tell after 1 year of publishing whether the thing was working or not.
That's very true. That is definitely a reason why they didn't fund the journalism or the operation itself. They funded becoming a sustainable operation within a year.
Correct. So they had a sustainability test, and the fact that they didn't have to fund the operating costs is, as you know, manna from heaven for every foundation, because that's the last thing they want to do, because then they don't know if the thing actually can survive without their care and help.
Now, I know this is probably a useful thing for a lot of member-based organizations, is to understand any advice you have around managing funder expectations. So if other member-based organizations also have foundation funding, whether that's kind of the rocket fuel to get started or to support them while they build up their membership base, do you have any advice or thoughts around how to keep those relationships good and healthy? Like I'm curious to know, okay, what advice do you have to give about maintaining those relationships? And then how did they handle the news of things not going well and failing? Were they thinking about putting more money in, or it was just like, nope, the writing's on the wall, it didn't work? If you could take us into that a little bit of how those funder relationships and conversations went.
Oh, the funders particularly, but and I mean, I suppose you mean the institutional funders, right? Not the members. Yes.
Not the members, yeah,
Oh.
the big money that came in for the
Right.
campaign, and
Oh no, they were very supportive, and if I would distill one lesson from the past few years in regards of this is be much more proactive on asking help. These people are there to make you succeed, and obviously, if you run into problems or you think, oh, this is not going well, the first inclination is to say, okay, we have to fix this, because they don't want to hear it's going badly. They have so much invested in this. We want to show them results, which is definitely not a good idea, because they want to hear what is going badly, because then the possibility arises that they can help with it. So the assumption that you have to deliver can be very problematic, in the sense that if you are not, and you feel ashamed to say so, you don't give them the opportunity to help you out. And my sense of how we did it is that they were way more willing to help than we were willing to ask for help.
yeah, Jay.
Well, this is a lesson, not necessarily for dealing with funders, but I think it's important thing that I've learned from this episode. It's really important to be trustworthy as a publisher of journalism, but it's not that important and can be counterproductive to talk about trust all the time and make it part of your brand. Because when you do that, you create a risk. And the risk is one thing that you do that's not trustworthy, and the whole thing can be brought into doubt. This is another risk in having raised money for a concept, but not having any journalism that proves that concept yet. That's actually a very fragile and risky state. And I don't think that we were aware of how dangerous that condition is. Similarly, it's important to speak truth. It's not that important to speak about truth as part of your brand, because when you do that, you invite, again, either attacks or criticism. And this is one of the big lessons in the Correspondent episode for me.
That does make me think, in terms of the attacks or the criticism, as someone who is on Twitter, like many journalists, seeing at least the campaign reaction that the journalistic industry, press, and ecosystem had to the campaign not working. It made me think, as a startup founder myself, do they understand how much power they might have right now in attacking what is a very fragile experiment? Like, doing any kind of startup is very, very difficult, as everyone on this call knows who's starting their own thing, and having a big PR nightmare is something that could potentially end it. What lessons did you take from taking that heat from the industry press? Did it make you think about how you are vocal or critique others as well, now having been in the seat of someone who's having journalism, quote, like, done to you? I'm curious to know from both of your perspectives, how that felt and if that's changed anything.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, every individual journalist that calls you up and makes a critical piece about you, for them, you are the only one that they have on the phone. For the other side, which in this case was the receiving end, was me, you have many of those people on the phone in a cumulative fashion. So As a journalist, you're probably not aware that you're one of many in these cases. So you necessarily are not the problem. It's the whole the media as a whole that sort of comes at you, and which can be very overwhelming. And it's not the fault of any individual journalist or media outlet that's part of it. It's the combination of factors that makes it so difficult and so overwhelming, etc. My biggest lesson in all that is that you have to be much more proactive in sharing not just your answers, but your questions, your dilemmas, your challenges, your thoughts, your mistakes, if we have, you tend to sort of try to solve the problem before you go out and tell everybody what you figured out, right? Here's what we're gonna do. This is our mission. This is our plan. This is our annual report. This is what we've done. Rarely do you say, we don't know. This is what we're breaking our heads about. This is really a problem that we now have and we can't figure it out. This is what we're thinking about now. If you do that way more proactively, I think the sort of the inevitable mistakes and problems you run into will be received much less critically, because you were there when you headed towards the problem. Not necessarily maybe from old journalists or competitors or whatever, but especially from the people who are watching it. If they were already on the path with you, for example, our newsroom controversy, if we would have proactively spoken to our members about the dilemmas that we face, costs problems, if you opened a second office, is it worth having a second office or not? Then we probably would have noticed, for example, that they may have expected us to do so. And we wouldn't have only heard about it after we decided it. So being much more proactive, if in the phase that you don't know yet, would be my biggest lesson.
There's
Jay,
no
what
doubt
about for you?
There's no doubt that the Correspondent and the campaign fucked up hugely in handling this question of where it would ultimately be located. And there's no doubt that it miscommunicated during the campaign in a serious and in some ways fatal way. And all of the criticism and online chatter and journalism that were done about those mistakes was about something real. It wasn't like a phony controversy. I don't believe that at all. At the same time, I would say this: American journalism eats its young, and Twitter heightens that appetite.
That is deep, Jay. I felt that in my bones. In terms of, we just have about 5 or so minutes left here, and there's some really fantastic questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to try and go through a few of these as well while we have time. All right, let's see. Ben Whitelaw wanted to know, what do you think the Correspondent's legacy will be if it has one? And either of you can jump in and start.
Well, I think a lot of people who are part of the NPP network and might be on this call can answer that just in the sense that they learned things from it, and they saw the possibilities of doing their own version by reading about what the Dutch Correspondent was doing. Which again is not to say that nobody else had these ideas or they originated in Amsterdam, that they didn't. But the whole idea of trying to find support from members as against advertisers, foundations, governments, rich people, or even subscribers. Just that the creation of the space of membership, which NPP then tried to develop in all these different ways that we do our research. That is the main legacy of the Correspondent.
Anything else to add there, Rob, or hard
I'm
agree?
way too Dutch to talk out loud about the legacy of the Correspondent. But I mean, all the lessons that we've learned from NPP, that sort of is a culmination of things that I hope will spread widely, because I still very much believe in the foundational principles that we have, and we learn new ways to implement them every day. So maybe ask me this in when I'm actually retired.
Okay, we need some time to be able to really look back on it. But I do agree, just having, been on the outside, hearing so many people be inspired by the Correspondent and then the Correspondent, you really opened up a lot of minds around what's possible. And, I think just launched all these incredible experiments that we're all learning from still, and hopefully are going to shape journalism for the future. So as an American, I will say, I've noticed a lot of good things that have come out of it. Anjali wanted to know, are there organizations that you see now that you want to point funders to, who have the trust and experience and the type of coverage that you wanted to do, that had those sort of core values that you feel like funders should be looking at and giving big dollars to? This is a great question, Anjali. If there are funders on the call, pay attention to these answers.
Oh, wow. Jay, you know the field. So
Well,
much.
I don't want to give the NPP stamp of approval to one or two organizations, because then all the rest will think that they didn't get it. It just doesn't feel right for what our organization is trying to do. I can list a lot of news sites that I think are really deserving of a lot of praise, but with that kind of thing on the line, I feel uncomfortable picking out one or two or three from 50 so or more organizations we've studied.
Okay, fair enough. Contact Jay and Ariel and the Membership Puzzle team funders if you want to hear more. In terms of, we've kind of covered a few of these here. So with the Correspondent having now died, so there's two questions I'm going to combine here. So HR Venkatesh and Patrick's, was the Correspondent ahead of its time? And do you think there will be a time that will come where there's some prospect for a global membership-based journalism platform to grow in its place? And if so, what should they do to grow and prosper?
I'll try that one for first. I think the model where you can start to see how it might work is closer to what The Guardian is doing. The Guardian is closest, I think, to a kind of global journalism, even though it's got a long way to go. And what they're doing is they have The Guardian UK, which has its own long history and its own place kind of in the British journalism space. And it's the other players in that space that give The Guardian its identity. But then they created The Guardian US, which is funded in a different way than The Guardian UK. And then they went on and created The Guardian Australia. And they all share certain tone and standards and look and feel, and they all borrow from the great tradition of The Guardian, but they are based in states, right? So if you can imagine The Guardian South Africa, The Guardian India, right? You can start to see how a global organization that nonetheless has a home in particular countries and does journalism about those countries could emerge. Nonetheless, to go back to one of my first answers, it's really important to know whether something like global, but in English, something like what the Correspondent was trying to do can work or not. Like failing at that and getting an answer back is super important. Just like getting an answer to, well, does pay what you can really work, or do people just pay $1 so that they can call themselves a member? Getting an answer to those things is really important. You have to try them, and when they fail, then you can at least say to other people, don't go down that road. We did, and it didn't work. And that's super important. And what I meant by journalism eats its young is sometimes journalists just jump on something that didn't work right away without realizing that it's really important to get those answers.
Yeah, I think the possibility is definitely still there. And I mean, it depends on kind of how long term are we thinking? I mean, if you look at sort of the world in the terms of current affairs, you see polarization everywhere. If you take the long-term view, there's much more unity globally and unification globally than ever. So it's sort of the question for this sort of, is global journalism possible, is sort of the same for me as global politics possible. It's very difficult. There are immense national tendencies that go against global politics. Ask anybody in the UK. Is there a possibility and a tendency to globalize politics to address the problems we all share as a species? Yes, there is. Is it easy? No. Is it one straightforward line? No. But I think on the long term, the technological possibilities and the shared knowledge that the human species has, and the tendency of unification that is apparent amongst our species, I think, yes, definitely also journalism is no different in politics in that sense, that we can achieve such a sort of more global outlook on our problems. But it's very, very difficult.
All right. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to ask one last question, and it's one that I have. I'm curious to know, we've talked a lot about failure and, failures in the eye of the beholder of, was it a failure? What was a success? But I also just love to hear from you. What are you most proud of that the Correspondent was able to do or achieve or test out? And specifically for Rob too, anything from the Correspondent's experiment that you now have taken over to the Dutch newsroom, anything that was able to inform and strengthen that organization? So maybe Jay, I'll start with you as to what you're most proud of from the experiment, and then end with Rob and what was.
Well, my answer is perhaps a little excessively personal. I decided to do with the Correspondent something I'd never done in my 35-year career, which is I went all in on supporting this organization. And I told everyone who read my blog, everyone who was part of my professional community, everybody who followed me on Twitter, which is a lot of people, to do the same. And on November 14th, 2018, I wrote a post called Letter to My Network, which was subtitled, I have never asked you for anything until today. And the request was, join the Correspondent. And that's what I mean by all in, meaning I put the entirety of my professional reputation on the line and saying, I want you to join this company. And even though I lost that bet, because ultimately, for my professional reputation, the mess around the Correspondent was a net negative. Even though I lost it, I'm still glad I did it, because that's the way you have to do things sometimes. You have to go all in. Like anyone who's married knows that. You're married, Jennifer. Like if you're going to do it, you better go all in, because that's the only way to succeed at it. And so even though I lost the bet, as I said, I feel like at some point in my career, I had to do that. And the reason that I did it was all of those things I listed at the beginning that were different about the Correspondent, that were worth trying, principles that are still important, ideas about journalism and how you can organize a responsive organization that is both for the reporters and for the members. All those things that I think will eventually become part of journalism's future were worth trying. And so I'm glad I did it.
Well, now you have my
What
answer.
about you?
I'm proud to hear somebody like Jay say that. And I mean, my answer is in that sense very personal too. I'm very proud that I got the opportunity to work with incredible people that 10 years ago were my professional idols, and they and Jay is absolutely. We called him ambassador #1 for a reason, and there were many others that also chimed in and supported the idea and believed in us, and getting that support from so many inspiring people is then getting to actually put it into practice with an amazing team. We had an amazing group of journalists, amazing group of editors who just jumped in, and so I'm incredibly proud. And in that sense, I also it did not hurt my worldview or view of people at all. It sort of showed me that people are willing to take great risks for their ideals. I became attracted to journalism largely because of its idealism. I mean, nobody is attracted to it because of its paycheck. So seeing so much idealism and getting the opportunity to work with those people is just, yeah, that's a gift you'll carry with you forever.
Jennifer,
Well,
thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both. I mean, to the Correspondent's values of being honest, transparent, and self-reflective, I think both of you brought so much of that to today, and I hope it's useful for the other membership-based organizations on the call. So thanks for being up for it.
Yep, I hope so too. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Jen.